The St. Augustine Lighthouse stood tall against the velvet Florida sky, its beams slicing through the night like an ancient guardian. For centuries, it had weathered storms, watched over the restless sea, and listened to the whispers of the wind. To many, it was a landmark of safety. To Claire Bennett, it was a story waiting to be uncovered. Claire, a freelance journalist with a penchant for chasing mysteries, had heard rumors about the lighthouse's haunted past, stories of accidents, tragedies, and children. If you stand there long enough, locals would say, you'll hear them. Laughter, light, innocent, but not for long. That night, Claire stood at the base of the lighthouse, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. She told herself it was the cold, not fear. Behind her, the waves crashed against the rocks, rhythmic and relentless. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, like rusted iron. She hesitated before climbing the stairs, her recorder clutched tightly in her other hand. The darkness inside was suffocating, broken only by her flashlight's narrow beam. The walls were damp, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. As she ascended, the steps creaked beneath her boots, echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. Her phone buzzed, a message from her editor. "Don't stay too long. Be safe," Claire snorted. Too late for that. At the first landing, she paused to catch her breath, shining her light around. Graffiti marked the walls. Hearts, names, dates, signs of ordinary people who had dared to step inside. But something about the space felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper here, shifting unnaturally. A faint giggle broke the silence. Claire froze. It was high-pitched, delicate, undeniably the laugh of a child. Her heart pounded. She scanned the area with her flashlight, every muscle tensed. "Hello?" she called, her voice firm but unsteady. No response. Another giggle, closer this time. Her light caught movement, a small shadow darting up the staircase. Claire's stomach churned. "This isn't real," she whispered, but her feet moved anyway, following the sound. The next floor was darker, colder. Her breath puffed visibly in the air. She felt the weight of the lighthouse pressing down on her, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the structure. Then she saw it, a tiny handprint smeared in something dark and wet on the wall. Claire's flashlight flickered. She smacked it with her palm, cursing under her breath. When the light steadied, she noticed something she hadn't before. More handprints leading up the stairs, small, childlike, and impossibly fresh. The giggle came again, louder now, echoing from above. Claire gritted her teeth. "You're just a story," she muttered, forcing herself to climb. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. As she ascended, the giggles grew louder, more distorted, tinged with an edge of malice. The walls seemed to close in, the steps narrowing. Her flashlight dimmed further, casting only a faint glow. Then abruptly, everything stopped. Silence. Claire stood in the darkness, her ears straining for any sound. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. She turned slowly, shining her light back down the staircase. Nothing. And then she heard it. A soft, sing-song whisper, right behind her ear. "Why are you here?" Claire whipped around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty staircase spiraling upward into oblivion. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breath, the cold air biting her throat. The whisper echoed again, faint and teasing. "You can't hide." Panic bubbled up inside her, but she forced it down. She'd covered ghost towns, abandoned asylums, and urban legends before. Those places had felt eerie, sure. But this was alive. The air thrummed with an almost tangible presence, like the lighthouse itself was watching her. Claire's fingers fumbled for her recorder. She clicked it on, her voice a hushed tremor. "Day 1, St. Augustine Lighthouse. I've encountered strange sounds. Laughter, whispers. It's colder here than it should be. unnaturally so. Her voice faltered as a faint creak echoed from above. Something, or someone, was moving. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking slightly. "If you're here, I just want to talk." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then a response. More laughter. High-pitched, distorted, and too close. It echoed down the staircase, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Claire's stomach twisted. Against her better judgment, she climbed further. Each step felt like a test, the air growing colder and the shadows darker. The beam of her flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. She reached the third landing, and the first thing she noticed was the smell. It hit her like a wave, damp, metallic, and rotten. She gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. The room was small, with peeling paint and cracked windows that let in faint streams of moonlight. Her flashlight swept across the space, and she froze. In the corner of the room stood a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one glass eye missing, the other staring blankly at the wall. The tattered dress it wore was damp, stained with something dark. Claire's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She stepped closer, her flashlight trained on the doll. The moment she reached it, a deafening slam echoed through the lighthouse. She spun around, heart pounding, but the door she had just passed through was still wide open. When she turned back, the doll was gone. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard anything move. There had been no sound, no indication that it had been taken. It was just gone. Suddenly, the laughter erupted again, this time deafening and all around her. It was no longer the innocent giggle of a child. It was something else, cruel, mocking, and layered with an unnatural distortion. Claire stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering wildly. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows growing and shifting like living things, and then she saw them, tiny figures darting through the darkness, just beyond the edge of her light. Small hands pressed against the cracked windows, leaving streaks of that same dark, wet substance she had seen earlier. Her voice caught in her throat. What do you want?" she managed to choke out. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her ragged breathing and the relentless crash of the waves outside. Then, the voice returned, a chorus of whispers overlapping and twisting together. "Stay." The room tilted violently, and Claire's vision blurred. She stumbled, gripping the wall for support, but the sensation didn't stop. The lighthouse felt alive now, its walls pulsing like a heartbeat. When her vision cleared, she was no longer on the third landing. She was back at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the spiral staircase. But something was different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. And then she noticed the footprints, tiny wet footprints leading up the stairs. Claire stared at the footprints, her breath catching in her throat. They shimmered faintly under her flashlight, each print impossibly small, as though left by a child walking barefoot. Her mind raced. Had she been here before? The walls felt unfamiliar now, the graffiti gone, replaced with smooth, cold stone. The air was suffocating, thick with the same metallic tang she had smelled earlier. Her hands trembled, but she tightened her grip on the flashlight. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, but the cold sinking into her skin told her otherwise. The sound of faint footsteps echoed from above, soft but deliberate, accompanied by a faint hum. It was the kind of tune a child might sing absent-mindedly while playing. Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry. She could turn back, leave the lighthouse, and never look back. But the journalist in her refused to let the story go. She gritted her teeth and began to climb again, her legs heavy as if the air itself resisted her movements. The hum grew louder with each step, mingled with occasional bursts of laughter. The sound was wrong, distorted, as if coming from a broken speaker. She paused on the next landing, her flashlight flickering again. The hum stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire scanned the area, her pulse hammering in her ears. The walls here were different, covered in faded murals. She stepped closer, running her fingers over the chipped paint. It depicted children playing on a grassy hill, their faces joyful. But as her light moved further, she saw the images change. The children were no longer playing. They were running, their faces twisted in terror. A dark figure loomed behind them, its form indistinct but menacing. Claire's stomach turned as she backed away. Her boot landed in something wet, and she froze. Slowly, she lowered her flashlight. Blood. A crimson pool spread across the floor, and in its center lay the doll. Its cracked face stared up at her, the single glass eye glinting in the dim light. Before she could react, the door to the staircase slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder, insistent. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. Claire pressed herself against the cold stone, her breath shallow. The knocking was everywhere now, surrounding her. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was worse. She turned slowly, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Her eyes landed on the doll again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Standing next to it was a child. At least, it looked like a child. Its features were pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow pits of darkness. The thing tilted its head, a grotesque smile spreading across its face. "Play with us," it whispered, the voice echoing in her head. Claire stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. She scrambled to pick it up, but when she looked up again, the child was gone. The air grew colder, biting into her skin like needles. Shadows began to writhe along the walls, stretching and twisting toward her. She bolted for the stairs, her boots slipping on the blood-soaked floor. The giggles returned, louder now, chasing her as she climbed. The stairs seemed endless, the space warping around her. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't stop. The laughter grew closer, the sound drilling into her skull, and then she reached it, the top of the lighthouse. The room was bathed in moonlight, and for a moment Claire thought she was safe. But then she saw them, dozens of children, their hollow eyes staring at her, their pale faces twisted into unnatural grins. They stood in a circle, the doll cradled in the arms of one. "You shouldn't have come," they said in unison, their voices a chilling chorus. The door slammed shut behind her, and Claire realized too late, there was no way out. Claire's back hit the cold door as she stared at the children, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The circle they formed seemed impossibly perfect, their pale hands linked together, their small bodies casting elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally across the room. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The doll lay in the arms of the smallest figure, its cracked face glinting in the moonlight. The child holding it stepped forward, and the others turned their heads in unison to follow its movements, their necks twisting at unnatural angles. "You can't leave," the child whispered, its voice soft but filled with something ancient and cold. Claire pressed her hands against the door behind her, fumbling for the handle. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The circle of children tilted their heads as one, the motion eerily synchronized. The doll's single glass eye caught the moonlight, and for a brief moment Claire thought it winked at her. "Stay," the children said together, their voices echoing unnaturally, overlapping in a haunting harmony. Claire shook her head, fear and adrenaline warring inside her. "I can't," she said, her voice rising. "I have to leave. I don't belong here." The smallest child let out a sharp, distorted laugh that echoed in the confined space. "You came. That means you do." The shadows on the walls began to writhe, curling and stretching toward her like living tendrils. Claire's flashlight flickered violently, casting the room into stuttering darkness. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the flashlight as if it could somehow protect her. When she opened her eyes again, the children were closer. They hadn't moved, at least not visibly, but the circle had tightened. She could feel their cold presence now, suffocating and oppressive. "You don't understand," Claire pleaded, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to disturb anything. I was just curious." The children's smiles widened, grotesque and unnatural. "Curiosity is dangerous," they whispered, their voices weaving together into a chilling melody. The smallest child stepped forward again, holding the doll out toward her. Its voice dropped to a low, guttural tone. "Play with us." Claire shook her head violently, her back pressed harder against the door. "No," she choked out. "I won't." The room seemed to shift around her, the walls bending and the floor tilting. The children began to hum, a haunting, discordant tune that vibrated through her skull. The doll's cracked face twisted into something resembling a smile, its single eye gleaming with malevolence. "You don't have a choice," the children said in unison, their voices booming now, filling the space. Suddenly, the floor beneath Claire's feet gave way, and she plunged into darkness. The world spun around her as she fell, the children's laughter echoing in her ears, growing louder and more distorted with every passing second. She hit the ground with a jarring thud, her head snapping back against the cold, damp stone. Pain shot through her skull, and for a moment, the world blurred. When her vision cleared, she realized she was back on the staircase. But something was wrong. The steps were warped, twisted in impossible directions, spiraling downward into a void of blackness. Her flashlight was gone, replaced by a faint, flickering glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The laughter continued, faint and distant, but growing louder with every second. Claire scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with something wet and sticky. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. Blood. It coated the steps, dripping down into the darkness below. A voice whispered behind her, soft and breathy. "You should have stayed." She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the endless spiral of stairs stretching upward into the void. The laughter grew louder, closer, and Claire realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't coming from behind her anymore. It was coming from within the walls. Claire staggered down the blood-slicked stairs, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The walls around her seemed to close in, pulsing as though alive, the faint flickering glow casting long, grotesque shadows. The laughter wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, wrapping around her like cold fingers, digging into her mind. It was relentless, mocking, and impossibly loud, yet muffled as if coming from inside her skull. She tried to steady herself, one hand on the railing, the other clutching her side where she had fallen. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just a story. Just a stupid ghost story," the walls responded. They exhaled, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the staircase. The air grew warmer, damp, with a sickly, metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Claire stumbled, her boots slipping on the wet, crimson-streaked steps. "Why are you running?" the voice whispered, now right at her ear. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head. A face stared back at her from the wall. It was pale, childlike, its hollow eyes peering out from the stone as if trapped within. Its mouth twisted into a smile that stretched far too wide, teeth jagged and sharp. "Stay with us," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Claire screamed, stumbling backward, her hands slipping off the railing. The face dissolved into the wall as though it had never been there, but the laughter erupted again, louder this time, echoing in every direction. She ran, her boots splashing through the slick blood, the stairs seeming to twist and stretch beneath her feet. No matter how far she went, the staircase never ended. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as though the walls were squeezing the life out of her. And then she saw it, the doll. It sat on the next landing, its cracked face tilted to one side, the single glass eye staring at her. Beside it stood a figure, a child, pale and translucent, its empty eyes fixed on her. Claire skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the confined space. The child tilted its head, its hollow gaze unblinking. "We were forgotten," it said, its voice soft and layered with pain. "Left behind. You'll stay with us. Forever." "No," Claire choked out, shaking her head. "I didn't do this. I'm not part of this." The child stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "But you came," it said simply. Behind her, more figures emerged from the walls, their faces pale and twisted, their bodies shimmering like smoke. They surrounded her, closing in, their whispers blending into an incomprehensible cacophony. Claire backed away, her hands shaking. Her foot landed on the edge of a step, and she stumbled, falling hard onto the stairs. The figures loomed over her now, their smiles widening, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. The smallest child knelt beside her, the doll clutched tightly in its hands. "Play with us," it said, its voice low and chilling. Claire shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "I won't!" The child's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Then you'll run." The walls around her convulsed, the staircase twisting and buckling. The figures vanished into the shadows, and the laughter swelled to a deafening roar. Without thinking, Claire scrambled to her feet and ran. The stairs blurred beneath her, the air burning her lungs. The laughter followed her, relentless and mocking, chasing her into the abyss. She didn't know where she was going. Down, up, it didn't matter. She just needed to escape. But no matter how far she ran, the staircase never ended. Her legs buckled, exhaustion taking hold. She collapsed onto the steps, her vision swimming. The laughter faded, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. And then she realized she wasn't running anymore. She was back at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the endless spiral of stairs, and the tiny wet footprints were still there. But now they were joined by her own. Claire's chest heaved as she stared at the footprints, tiny, wet imprints that seemed to mock her desperation. Her own prints mingled with theirs now, a silent admission that she had become part of the lighthouse's story. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't happening." But it was. The air around her shifted, heavy with an unnatural stillness. Even the ocean's relentless crash outside seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive silence. The spiral staircase loomed above her, an unending path into darkness. Behind her, the faint sound of humming began again, soft, childlike, and maddening. Claire whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The smallest child stood at the base of the stairs, its hollow eyes fixed on hers. The doll dangled limply in its hand, its single glass eye catching the faint glow of the lighthouse. "Why are you still here?" the child asked, its voice emotionless, as if it already knew the answer. Claire shook her head, backing away. I don't know. I don't know how to leave." The child tilted its head, considering her words. "You don't leave." "Not really." The words sent a chill down her spine. Her back hit the wall, and she realized she was cornered. The child stepped closer, its translucent form flickering in and out of focus. "What do you want from me?" Claire demanded, her voice breaking. The child's hollow eyes seemed to darken, its smile returning, a wide, grotesque grin. "We want what we lost." "And what's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The child didn't answer. Instead, it raised the doll, holding it out toward her. The whispers began again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing in the confined space. "Stay, play, remember." Claire's knees buckled under the weight of the voices. She clutched her head, her thoughts unraveling as the whispers filled her mind. Images flashed before her eyes, children running, laughing, then falling silent. The lighthouse, towering and indifferent, swallowing them whole. She screamed, the sound ripping from her throat as she fell to the floor. I can't. I don't belong here. The child crouched beside her, its icy fingers brushing her cheek. You came, it said softly. That means you were chosen. The walls began to pulse again, the lighthouse's heartbeat matching her own. The staircase twisted, warping into impossible angles, and the whispers grew deafening. Suddenly everything stopped. Claire opened her eyes to find herself standing at the very top of the lighthouse. The circular room was bathed in cold, silvery moonlight. The children were there, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They stood in a perfect circle around the room, their expressions blank, waiting. In the center of the circle was the doll, now sitting upright. Its face was no longer cracked, and its eyes, both of them, shone with an unnatural light. Claire's body moved without her consent, her legs carrying her toward the doll. She tried to stop, to scream, but she was no longer in control. The smallest child stepped forward, its voice echoing inside her head. It's your turn now. No! She screamed, her voice echoing in the empty room. But it was too late. The doll's eyes met hers, and a wave of cold swept through her body, freezing her in place. The children began to hum again, their voices weaving together in an ancient, haunting melody. Claire's vision blurred, the room spinning around her. Her thoughts fragmented, her memories slipping away like sand through her fingers. She reached out, desperate to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing left. The last thing she saw was the doll's smile, impossibly wide, before darkness consumed her. Weeks later, tourists at the St. Augustine Lighthouse reported hearing strange sounds at night. Whispers, laughter, and a woman's voice calling out faintly, echoing up the staircase. Some claimed to see a figure at the top of the lighthouse, a woman with hollow eyes, holding a cracked doll. They said if you listened closely, you could hear her whisper, "Don't come, don't stay. It's already too late."